All right, so this is how skin works, filmed before a live studio audience at Lee College. Yeah, okay. So we have 4 topics that we're going to talk about today as quickly as we can. Thermoregulation is one of the major roles that the skin plays in body physiology. Protection from UV light is obviously another one. Vitamin D synthesis, and then not really a physiology of the skin as much as how the skin repairs itself. But that's an important topic, and we haven't really dealt with it anywhere else in the course, so this is a good place to do it. Okay, so skin responses to temperature. Obviously, the variable we're dealing with here is temperature. But we also have 2 possible initial changes, okay? So we can either get too hot, or we can get too cold.
Thank you.
Okay. So anybody remember from our last unit back, the general senses, what the name for a sensor that senses temperature is?
Dermal.
Very good. Aaron's the man. Okay. So a thermoreceptor, and these are going to be dermal thermoreceptors here. While we're on a roll, anybody remember the part of the brain that is in charge of regulating body temperature? Hypothalamus. Okay. Okay. So far, the pathway is the same. We have dermal thermoreceptors that communicate to the hypothalamus whether the body is too hot or too cold. Where we start seeing differences is in the effectors. So obviously, if you're too hot, the sweat glands are going to be sort of your go-to effector, right? And their response is going to be to secrete sweat. And as that sweat evaporates from your body, it carries away heat. The other major effector we have here are the dermal blood vessels. And the response that they have is they bring blood to the surface of the skin by dilating. So that, and the response to that is again to carry away heat from the body. Okay, so as we have heat radiating away from our blood vessels and heat evaporating away from our sweat, obviously that's going to have an effect of a negative feedback to oppose the initial condition, which was that we were too hot. Okay, fun stuff happening in the back room there. We actually have the same one of the same effectors over here on the too cold side is the dermal blood vessels. Okay? Their response in this case is going to be to constrict and keep blood away from the skin. Okay? And that's going to retain heat in the body core. But we also have, here on the too cold side, we have the erector pili muscles, and they're going to erect the hairs. Okay? Which is great if you're a really hairy guy, usually, but not so great if you're most of us. Okay, the net effect is you get goosebumps. If we had a lot of hair, causing our hair to stand up would create a layer of insulation around our body that would trap heat, but we don't. Most humans do not have that much hair. So really, this is a much weaker negative feedback here than on the hot side. Our body is much more effective at getting rid of heat than it is at keeping heat in our body when it's cold outside. I have this ongoing fight with some of my friends who live up north that they say it's better to live where it's cold because you can always put on extra clothes. And I say it's better to live where it's warm because your body's better at getting rid of heat than it is at retaining heat. But it doesn't matter. I live where I live and they live where they live. But anyway. Okay. All right. So that's thermoregulation. Our next major topic is UV light. So the situation is this: your skin is out in the sun for, a day in the sun. You're out at the beach, maybe. You are living where it's warm, and you take off all your clothes in the summer, and you're out at the beach, and your sun is getting hit by light. There are two options. Option A is that the pigment called melanin absorbs the light. If melanin absorbs the UV light, it reduces the damage to your cells. Also, light-colored melanin darkens in response to UV light. So if you're a pale-skinned person, you get this sort of instant tan just from having been exposed to enough light that one day. That's not a lasting tan. That's not going to protect you for more than a few days because that melanin is going to be shed with that set of skin cells, and you'll get more light-colored melanin following behind it. If you want a lasting tan, you have to wait for melanocytes in the stratum basale, way down at the bottom, to make more melanin in response to UV light. Now, when I say UV light, what I really mean is UV damage. Okay? In other words, if you're going to get a tan, you have to actually damage your melanocytes a little bit to get them to respond by making more melanin. This is why there's a whole school of dermatologists out there who say tanning is bad for you no matter what, because you're incurring some amount of skin damage just to get the tan. Now, there's another group of dermatologists out there who say, well, you're going to get hit by sunlight anyway. You might as well develop a little bit of a tan that'll protect you from worse damage later on. So there's some argument there. What nobody is saying is go spend your day laying in a UV tanning booth and get such a huge dose of UV radiation that you're guaranteeing yourself skin cancer later in life. So this tanning process can protect from skin damage, but the important words here are if done slowly. Pretty much all the dermatologists I've read agree that if you're going to get a tan, you need to do it gradually, maybe half an hour at a time of exposure instead of laying out all day trying to get the ultimate tan all at once. Okay. Option B over here is that your keratinocytes absorb the light. This is the bad option. If there's not enough melanin around to absorb that UV light and the keratinocytes get the UV is going to damage cellular DNA. Okay, this is not good. Cells release molecules that cause pain and do something called inflammation. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. Inflame the dermis. That's going to dilate blood vessels to try to bring in healing white blood cells, but in the process it creates a lot of redness and swelling and pain and that whole thing you associate with a sunburn. If damage is severe enough, we create cells called sunburn cells. That's actually what they're called. That are sufficiently damaged that they can't survive anymore. And what these cells are supposed to do is undergo a programmed cell death called apoptosis. Okay, they're supposed to do the ultimate taking one for the team and just disassemble themselves so that they don't do any more damage. Cells that aren't damaged, the surviving keratinocytes, will divide to replace the cells that are damaged, and ultimately that leads to a thickening of the epidermis called hyperplasia. If you've ever seen people who've spent their whole lives out working in the sun and they have kind of leathery skin, that's what that's from, is just repeated incidents of hyperplasia. Finally, worst of all, sunburn cells that don't die can be transformed into pre-cancer cells. And these precancerous cells can either be shed with the eventual shedding of skin cells that always happens, or they can embed themselves in the epidermis so well that over time they form a tumor. Okay. Keratomas, tumors of keratinocytes, are not very dangerous. Melanomas, tumors of melanocytes, are almost always malignant and very, very bad. Okay. On a happier note, you can also use UV light to make vitamin D. Okay. So your body makes something I'm going to call pre-vitamin D. It's a steroid-like molecule that in itself doesn't do anything. But it gets sent to the skin, goes up all these little blood vessels to the epidermis, and in the presence of sunlight, it reacts to form biosynthetic vitamin D3. So this is Biosynthetic means your body made it. Okay? At the same time, you're getting dietary vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 from milk and other sources of food. These are converted by the liver to what we might call storage forms of vitamin D3 that will circulate in your bloodstream for a long time, for forever and ever if necessary. Eventually, the kidney senses that you're low on calcium. Okay? And it produces the active form of vitamin D3 called calcitriol. And that goes to your digestive tract and increases absorption of calcium, which, as we know, is necessary for nerve function and muscle function and all sorts of other things. So if you're low on vitamin D, you're going to feel very sluggish and low energy, and you're not going to feel very good because you're not absorbing enough calcium into your body. And in fact, people who don't make enough vitamin D because they live in maybe a northern latitude where it's very dark during the winter, there's a name for that. They call it seasonal affective disorder, or SAD for short. Oh. Okay. All right. Which brings us to our last topic, dermal wound healing. First off, to be a dermal wound healing process, you actually have to damage the blood vessels and the collagen fibers of the dermis. Okay, if you just do a little paper cut that just cuts the epidermis, that's way easier to heal. The epidermal cells just reproduce where they are and they fill in the gap. But if you actually damage the dermis, that's a big freaking deal. Okay, and there are classically 4 stages of understanding how this works. The first stage is called hemostasis, which is Latin for stop the bleeding. Not to be confused with homeostasis, which is a completely different deal. Okay, hemostasis, stop the bleeding, starts within seconds of the injury and lasts several minutes. Okay, so for most dermal wounds, within a few minutes of the injury, most of the bleeding should be stopped. If you're still gushing blood, you've either gotten deeper than the dermis or you've got some clotting disorder or something. This limits blood loss in several ways, including what's called a platelet plug, and of course blood clot formation, which is what's ultimately going to give rise to the scab that covers the wound, in addition to just being a blood clot. Okay, then we get to inflammation. Blood vessels become dilated and permeable. Can't read that. To bring immune cells into the wound. The idea here is if we've had bleeding to begin with, we've probably let some bacteria into the wound. So we've got to bring some white blood cells, some cleanup crew to re-sterilize the wound area. Okay, and this period lasts anywhere from hours to sometimes days, depending on how dirty the wound was and how much damage there was to it. a little skinned knee might have the inflammation for just a few hours. A really deep gash in your skin, it might last for several days. Now, we're all kind of programmed at this point in history to think inflammation is a bad thing. I mean, we take anti-inflammatory drugs, for goodness sake. In this case, inflammation is actually good for you. It's there to bring immune cells to the wound and clean things up. So you don't really want to fight the inflammation too much. And some of this, putting ice on your wound to reduce the inflammation is actually a little bit counterproductive if you do it too quickly, because it keeps the cleanup crew from getting there and being too effective. Okay. Then we get the proliferation. This is where we're actually starting to repair the wound now. We form something called granulation tissue, which starts to form between 2 to 5 days after the injury. And here, our good friends, the fibroblasts, fill the wound space with new collagen fibers. Which start to close the wound. Okay, they're going to retract the wound into a more closed kind of space. At the same time, an epithelial covering begins to form as soon as the granulation tissue is in place, as soon as there's viable dermal tissue for the keratinocytes to cover over. Okay, and the keratinocytes on either side of the wound will actually start crawling in to fill in the empty space as soon as there's some granulation tissue there for them to cover. And finally, the wound begins to grow new blood vessels, because all of those fibroblasts and keratinocytes and all of those are going to get hungry. So they need to have a blood supply. Granulation tissue starts out kind of a gray color because it doesn't have much blood supply, and then it slowly gets pinker and pinker and pinker as the blood supply develops underneath it. Last but not least, we have a process called maturation, where for months after the wound closes, the collagen fibers get progressively reoriented so that they match the skin on either side of the wound, okay, along tension lines. And that's going to increase the strength of the new skin and reduce scarring. A wound that's too deep or wide, there's no way to get around the fact that you're going to have some scarring, okay? But the longer the wound is allowed to heal and mature, the less scarring there's going to be, the more normal skin is going to be found in that wound site. And last, I have a couple of pictures of how this works. The first picture here just shows the basic setup. The wound is deep enough here that it's cut some blood vessels and disrupted the collagen of the dermis. Step 2 shows the end of hemostasis and the beginning of inflammation. You've got a lot of white blood cells here starting to clean up the wound, macrophages here, and you've got a big blood clot up here at the surface that is now closing off the wound and forming a scab to keep what's under it sterile, at least as sterile as possible. And then we have the two types of proliferation shown in this one. The granulation tissue is forming here under the scab, and then as it forms, the epithelial cells are starting to invade from either side, and you can see here they are having formed a complete layer over the wound. You still have a little bit of a scab up here at the top at this point, but you've got a completely closed wound at this point. Okay. And that's it for my skin physiology. Anybody have any questions?